Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor again for me to reintroduce Admiral Kannan to chair session 4. Admiral remains very fresh in our minds with his excellent presentation on Indian shipyards during the forenoon session. Hence, I will straight away kick off the proceedings. Over to you, Admiral sir.
Thank you, Venu. Am I audible enough?
You are.
Yeah, okay, right. So we have a very interesting session, which is session 4. And I understand after this you have the panel discussion, which would be the final session. So on this session on marine science and technology, including the research and development, we have three presentations. One of the speakers is from the academia. You have another person who is working in an R&D institution. You have the third speaker, very illustrious speaker who was working for a long time in ISRO, and then he was in Ocean Information Center, and thereafter he has been giving the leadership portion of the Ministry of Earth Sciences. And I'm sure that will be something to look forward to hear from him, hear from all these speakers about the various aspects which they have planned to share with us today. So the first speaker would be Professor Kamakoti from IIT Madras. He's going to speak to us on cyber capacity and capability of the adversary. And how does this play out in the maritime arena? We all know that there has been an increase in cyber activities. Some of us have been victims to small level cyber crimes, but at a much bigger level, at the national level, countries are vulnerable against cyber capacity and capability of their adversaries. And that's what Professor Kamakoti is going to share with us. He is presently a professor in the Department of Computer Science at IIT Madras. He specializes in computer architecture, VSLI, and system integration. He has been a part of the academic research team at Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and the Indian Institute of Mathematical Sciences at Chennai. He has also been involved in the National Security Advisory Board as one of its members, and participating in very important policy evolutions regarding cyber crimes and cyber architecture, which countries, how they are vulnerable they are and how you can protect yourself. Very recently, he has been awarded the Dr. Abdul Kalam Technology Innovation Award, which leads to a fellowship as well. So welcome to Professor Kamakoti. We look forward to your presentation. I hand over the microphone to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, and hope you can see my slides.
Yeah, please share it. Yeah, it's visible now.
So, when we are looking at cyber security, I think we need to, one of the important things that we need to look at is China, because that is going to be a major threat for us. And so, as of now, in all my recent presentations, where we need to have a concentration on China and security, specifically from a critical sector point of view, I am basically looking at China's capability and vis-a-vis what we need to do to match that and see that we are safe. Though I don't have any big introduction to maritime and what is happening there, etc., but certainly what is going to happen in the critical sector, what we are seeing today, it is the same that is going to be applicable to maritime. So I thought that the best thing that I could present to the audience today is a view of what our neighbors are and how powerful they are becoming and what is it that we need to do, and specifically from a critical sector point of view. So whether it's going to be Air Force or Navy, there is going to be communication and there is going to be onboard computing systems, and these systems may be purchased outside from outside, and this can have the entire compute and software stack, and this can be also imported. And what are all the different issues that are going to come? As a part of that, I thought I will make and flag all those issues so that people who are well versed in each of these critical sectors can take the points that are relevant for them. But I'm trying to give a sort of a generic presentation that will be quite applicable in the case of maritime too. So we need to look at China from their, essentially from what we call as their cosmological communism, the Marxist ideology they had. Over a period of years, over centuries now, that they have actually been, promoting the idea of trying to get a overall control over the entire community, entire globe, and they have this 2050 plan of how they can become the world leaders following certain principles, right? So they have all these bridling and feeding, heavenly court, all under heaven, these type of very good ideologies, at least from their point of view. And they did form a very interesting set of administration structures that you see on the right hand side, which actually is going with that policy, and they actually want to become one of the world leaders within the very short period of time, like 2050. So this is something that is highly imbibed into their culture, essential structure, bone structure, and that is something that we need to pay attention from the point of view. Now, if you look at their education also, from 1919, they were just mathematics. Then they went to archaeology, geology. As early as 1960, they started getting back all those Chinese who were there as a part of this entire structure, and they got back them to China, and then they had certain agrarian crisis where they tried to make industrialization, and then of course they had this agrarian issues, and then of course they started building up this nice infrastructure of their current PLAs and stuff. So the education system also has been fine-tuned to this, and then you see the set of interesting developments over a period of time, specifically their intellectual property, how they had basically got into this, and then this Commission of Science, Technology and Industry for National Defense as early as 1982, and they did have this science and technology management system and accelerate science and technology process over a period of two decades, spawning over 2 decades, 1985, 1996, and this has become their defining moments. So today, when you look at, for example, a country actually bans China, say, and Android says they can't support an operating system, Google says they will not support. Next day morning, they are able to come out with their own system. If GPS is denied, they have the Beidou. So every sanction that is put on them, they almost have an immediate answer, which is as good as the world class, and that is something that we need to learn from them. And these are all very important lessons that we need to keep in mind when you are looking at cyber security, because they are going to be the closest and the most interested in our cyber things. And they have a massive program, as you see. They have 62 goals spread across 11 major areas, in which of course the maritime and national defense comes out in a very big way. And so this is something like they talk of 2025 complete made in China, right? What is happening here, right? So 2025, they say everything made in China. Every need for them should be addressed in China. 2030, they have a very big AI goal, and 2035 China standards. They're trying to push their own standards. and I'm also going to come and touch upon some of those things here, and leading to a China 2050 vision, right? Certainly, this is actually the time where there is a role. I think government is bringing out a lot of Make in India policy. They are very serious about it. They are very sincere about that. And this is where all industry plus end users plus public enterprises, public-private enterprises should come together and pitch in for this and make this program a success. I think that is one lesson that we get out of these first 5 slides. And these are the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and you see all the 8 major programs that they have kept in mind. It is something phenomenally things. So you have health, you have space and ocean exploration capability, you have national and public security systems, which are of very high relevance for them. Now, they have this 22 disruptive technologies, and certainly there are lot more that you see specifically from the supercomputing, AI, and cyber security issues here. And so they are the S&T initiatives of strategic importance, and there is a clear demarcation and specific allocation of funds, etc. So these are the 10 core industries for Made in China by 2025, and that you see there as the 4th entry here. Maritime engineering, equipment, and high-tech chips are going to be part of that 10 core industries here. And 2025 is a major they want to become a major manufacturing power. 2035 they are looking at global manufacturing power, and 2049 they are looking at leading manufacturing superpower. So this is the way they have defined, and this is the way they are going. So keeping all these in mind, let us another most important thing from a cyber security point of view, they have built this entire portfolio. It is not that I make finally one product. Now we see when after this PLI, there are certain products which are actually bought from China, put Indian label and being sold. Like the MOD has come out with a set of list of things that you should not buy now. So this is essentially the structure. So they are looked at support systems, all smart network infrastructure, internet security guarantee systems, industrial training, resourceful and standard testing, and IPR service. See the very good complete. Even when you map it onto your maritime, you look at all these 4 are going to be extremely important components for you. They have built that, and then on top of it, they come out with the core tech foundations like your chips and the semiconductor manufacturing, and lot of open source platforms for R&D, a lot of smart sensors, which are going to be inherent part of your overall IT infrastructure that you may put in a ship also, for example. And then or any of your defense, Navy or Air Force or whatever. And then comes all your key equipments, smart robots, smart control equipment, smart detection equipment, smart logistics equipment. And then on top of all this, the smart products are being built. And the smart products go from all the way from drones to video imaging systems and many things that will be part of many of the major strategic installations also. So you see from supplier to manufacturer to vendor, everything they have a very controlled supply chain, and that is going to be the next step. That is going to define the success for moving forward for them, and that is something which is very important for us to look at. So this is the overall what you call as the policy network, and manufacturing is going to be very important there, and maritime actually becomes one of the important components of this manufacturing in 2025. And then you see this entire innovation toolbox that they have put, and then as you see that there are many IT components that come here. For example, the last part, there is an industrial espionage, which basically happens through the IT, through the cyber world. Often they are contested, denied, and debated, but then espionage has been in a very big way. And then if you also look at the some of the STEM companies, the science, technology, engineering, management companies, the top are cyber type of companies like Baidu, which has a very interesting search engine today, which can compete directly head-on with Google, and then of course Huawei, which we are thinking of whether to have them or throw them out. So these are all some of the very important issues here. So given this, I just wanted to touch on China, because unless we understand China, we really can't. China will be a good case study for us to basically understand what is it that we need to do from here, because they are going to be the major threat in the near future. So with this as a background, let me now start talking about some of the changing attacks that are happening on our critical infrastructure. I'll take one or two examples here, and then I'll talk about the need for indigenization and what could be a possible solution to this. So I've been given time till 3:10, right? So I have that much time, sir. How much time I have for this?
Till 3:05. I'll give you a reminder at 3:05.
Okay, so 3:05. Okay.
Right. The
So
5 more minutes are there.
Thank you very much. So the changing landscape is that, education actually took us from thumb impression to signature. The technology is taking back from signature back to thumb impression. And now the attacks are now not on individuals, it is now on organization. And attacks are not disk-based, where we can have proof of attack, etc. This is all in memory. So they come, they attack and go. It is like time, right? The time is lost. You can't be a master of your time. It's over. So last second is over. That's all. I can't get it back. Like that, this attack is done and it's over. There's nothing that we can trace out of it. So this has become that much complex. And many times the attacks is completely out of control of the victim. I'm going to give one or two interesting examples in this direction. And so there are some issues in fixing these vulnerabilities. What are the things? Let us get a good understanding in the next 5 to 6 minutes. Now I'm going to talk about an ATM attack. This is something which will be appealing to all, but you can easily extend it to a context of a maritime communication, where some X place to Y place you are communicating, and how can it be intercepted. See, let us take this, right? So let me say you are a customer of Bank A and you want to withdraw money from the ATM of Bank B, right? So you go to Bank B's ATM, you insert your card. Now that immediately that information goes to the other bank switch, that Bank B switch. The Bank B says it is not my card, so it sends it to this Master, Visa, RuPay, and Master, Visa, RuPay now finds out it is Bank A's card, so it sends to the Bank A's data center. There will be one ATM switch, and that switch will basically find out, okay, whether you are an account holder there or not, and whether your PIN is correct. So it checks with that, and then finally it takes from it goes to your core banking. It finds out you have enough balance, and then so this fun part from S1, S2, S3, S4, S5. Now you go back saying okay. Now one of the attacks was that the ATM switch got attacked. I'll tell you how it got attacked, but it got attacked, and what the attacker did was, for some specific card numbers, he will just not even check the PIN, nor he'll check the balance. He'll say okay. So from the S5 itself, right? So your PIN will not be checked, nor your core banking account will be checked, and you will be allowed to withdraw the money, right? So even if you don't have balance and you don't know the correct PIN, you can basically withdraw the money. And this was the attack. Now the interesting thing is that Master, Visa, they are all world class, but all the communication from S1 to S5 are encrypted, but S5 back to S1 completely goes in plain text. That is what we found out as a forensic audit, right? And then till now they are not fixed, but there's the leg-to-leg encryption that needs to be done. It's not fixed till now. Okay, but now the other interesting thing is so that was the major one drawback. The other important issue is how this fellow entered into the ATM switch, and that is very interesting. Now, if you see, there was a router which belonged not to the financial institution, not to the bank. It was some router laying somewhere provided by the ISP, and that router had an exploit, right? And now, the hacker actually logged into that router, and whatever traffic came from this bank, instead of going to the original destination, they route it through a malicious website, And when they route it through the malicious website, they use that to actually drop the hardware, drop the malicious Trojan or the code into the system, right? So that is how, so the firewall doesn't know that it is being routed somewhere. It just thinks that this is coming from a whitelisted site, but this routing actually brought back the malware into the system. So this was a very interesting case where the router is completely out of control of this entire banking fraternity. Whatever audit you have done, you may not found this router to be there. And this is a sort of a novel attack. So every attack had a novelty, and by this, within half an hour, this bank lost about $3 to $4 million across 27 countries, 8,000 transactions. Okay, so that is the massive network people have. So why I'm saying this is that this is one excellent example, though very good for an academician, for very bad for the bank. But this is a very excellent example where things are certainly out of your control and you are basically getting it. And so this is, I just wanted to throw this example, and many times the communication network is where we are getting compromised. The communication network where you have these type of leakage of information. The communication network is where you have all these sort of attacks, and and also the communication infrastructure where you have this denial of service, where you pump in so many packets so that the opponent cannot even react to it. And so these are some things which we need to be extremely careful, especially in the defense systems. And this is some very interesting example. Today, we need to have absolute control over the route in which a packet is actually translating, and that warrants a very careful network design, and that also warrants a lot of indigenization. Okay, so today the next step is going to be 5G. 5G is not you are going to see HDTV on a mobile phone. 5G is all about you are going to have a large more industrial revolution that is going to come. You are going to have the Industry 4 essentially based on 5G. You are going to have all your defense systems, etc., completely out of 5G, because that is going to give you a lot more of bandwidth, and all your command control can happen over this level of thing. And if you really want to face an enemy, the amount of ICT, amount of bandwidth, and amount of information exchange that you have with your control center actually determines whether you are going to win the war or lose the war. And that is also becoming very crucial here. With 5G, there are going to be a lot more of electronics floating around, and these electronics have to be extremely secure, right? And if you look at some of the attacks that had happened, this is about Baltimore. This is Nemesis, goddess of retribution, which will perish all immoderate fortune. This is the NSA of USA, which were released several sort of these exploits, and one of those exploits reportedly has come back to them. And one day morning, the Baltimore county or whatever, that district, when they opened the system, completely it was locked, right? So Baltimore was the epicenter of that attack, and there were Microsoft Windows XP and Vista systems vulnerability there, which was exploited to get this ransomware. So if you look at the history of these exploits, NSA USA actually got these exploits done, and one disgruntled employee of NSA USA leaked it to shadow brokers. The shadow brokers openly put these exploits. The moment these exploits were put, this Microsoft, Cisco, Palo Alto, all of them actually became major affected parties. And these were only exploits. And today, one of those exploits is called Eternal Blue, and that actually turned out to be WannaCry in NotPetya. Actually, FedEx, it was one earliest example was FedEx, which lost $400 million because of this. And what does China do? China actually got access to these NSA tools and reworked on those. They did not do anything. They just had an honeypot. They found out how USA was hacking into them, learned the trick of hacking, and started hacking outside. So this is the very interesting Chinese model. This is actually the screen you get in NotPetya, see, all these reasons for that was the NSA of the US, which was actually having these things with them. So this is the contribution of NSA of USA, and now they are banning Huawei. That's another different story for us. Now, so when you look at this 5G, which is going to be extremely crucial, anywhere you are going to take off cybersecurity, telecommunication networks. So we need technology, we need security, we need cost, we have to look at governance and also international standards. And the supply chain today, any product that we look goes at least 7 to 8 countries and come back. Anywhere in the supply chain, before you actually purchase a product, if it goes through quote unquote our friendly countries, then we are going to have a major issue. And that is one very important reason why we are looking at 100% indigenization. So the part is today, when we look at the 5G or for the 4G or even 5G, a lot of software has come and we are software giants. So we need to basically get our own indigenous core and indigenous networks. And that is going to be extremely crucial. We need to have complete control over the design, the architecture, and also the software code. Wherever you are going to deploy it, whether it's in maritime, it's going to be strategic, it's going to be bank, or it's going to be in civilian, anywhere. And COVID has taught us that electronics is very crucial, critical component for running our day-to-day life. This whole video conferencing is not possible if this electronics doesn't work. And so this is also very important. And most importantly, the centric brain of these systems are going to be microprocessors. So Swadeshi microprocessor is going to be very important. The government of India has come out with this Swadeshi microprocessor challenge. We have 2 processors, one from IIT Madras, another from CDAC, in which many designs are going to be made. But this microprocessor encouragement is going to be extremely crucial, and all the defense forces have to take this up very seriously, because that is the brain. And if the microprocessor could be compromised, you could put a Trojan there, the entire system can be made to dance to the tune. So the microprocessor, the programming entity, the brain of that should be completely under our control. And then the other important thing is that today we need to have very strong PCB testing facility. Anything that goes into the strategic systems, your ships or anywhere, all the PCBs have to be tested, because now you see a big area of attacks that come where these PCBs, small pencil tip level chips are put in PCBs, which can kill, which can leak data for you, and which can do some drastic things. And another important thing today, we are talking about standards. India has come out with this low mobility, large coverage standard, which is also very important for the maritime also, because it gives you a 12-kilometer range for 5G, and with a lot of fight, we got it approved in ITU. Our own people opposed it. Our own industry here, local industry, had been opposing it, and they continue to oppose it, and now it has to be part of the GPP. I think one of the things that the armed forces should adopt is to get this 5G standard, and we sincerely hope that this will be made mandatory, at least in India. So, but this is one big achievement, and the moment we are part of a standard, essential patent, then we get a lot more control, and that is why the other entities do not want us to get this. And there's been a lot of resistance, and we've been fighting this resistance. And
Professor Kamakodi, would you just conclude in another 5 minutes?
Yes, I'm going to. Thank you very much. So the other important thing is capacity skill set development. So we have critical sectors, including transport, power and energy, telecom, banking, government and strategic public enterprises. We need to have sector-wise cybersecurity professionals to be accredited, and that is going to be a very crucial program. And we are actually recommending at whatever forum we are talking, including this, that there should be a national sector-wise cybersecurity accreditation program, and that is extremely important. And the other important thing is that like how we have a war readiness, there's a DEFCON that is defined by the US government, where they say that if this is something like this, if there is a nuclear war, or if there is a normal condition versus the next level, where is some small riots, versus some little tensed, and then some border issues, and then they go to almost to become a nuclear war, and then a nuclear war. So they have DEFCON 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like that. Like that, we need to also have a cyber conditions here, and it is also applicable to all these classified services, where a normal condition can be there. That will be some unrest, and so what we should do, and then there's going to be a major social unrest, or there is a major cyber attack. What are the things that we need to do? So we need to have certain services up. So today, when we say that the entire security is delivered through IT, and then there is an IT attack, we can't shut down the IT services and still deliver something. So it becomes a chicken and egg. So we have to have very, very safe and secure way of delivering certain critical services. So we need to have classification of services, and we need to have fine-grained control over how to get these services up. And that is also very, very important. With this, I wind up. Thank you for this opportunity, and I am now open to questions here.
Thank you, Professor Kamakoti. Questions we will have at the end, and I'm happy that you just introduced the audience to a very wide range of aspects pertaining to cyber crime and cyber developments which are taking place, which make not only organizations vulnerable, but at the national level also you find the vulnerability comes in because the backbone of your networks, etc., is getting affected. But what I liked was that, you could trace back and say, this is one country, I'm referring to China, which had ambitions very nicely scripted about 75 years back at least, to make sure that they would be progressing national level development programs, which can bring them right to the front and also make sure the other nations are left far behind, in fact. And the way they progress their electronics, artificial intelligence, come out with smart products and capable of industrial espionage. And we have heard some stories about what had happened in some of our power transmission systems because of some developments on this front. But as we go along, we find that we are also, our country is also progressing to Industry 4.0. which not only brings services into operation based on a network, but also actual production networks are also linked to Industry 4.0. A large number of very critical operations which are being done in production are dependent on networks which have data which remotely monitor the progress of work and then control the machines as well. So it is very important that we are well protected in our desire to go to Industry 4.0, which definitely is an efficiency enabler. We would also be allowing the network to come in between the actual execution of the production work and network which is controlling it. In between, you will have vulnerability coming in from the various electronic switches and routers, which you said, and you give the example of what happened in the ATM episode as well as the Baltimore computer debacle. So there is a lot for us to learn. Of course, two important things for the audiences. One is that India has got its own program for developing a microprocessor as a part of the Swadeshi microprocessor program. And also one important lesson, in which in fact the Navy has been doing it to a certain extent, that hardware and software don't come from the same supplier. You always had the hardware supplied from a particular source, but then we have been insisting, at least at the system level, all the software will be developed by the user itself, which brings in some amount of assurance that the various applications which you are developing would have a homegrown solution, but also will throw up if there are any problems in the system software, which has been put as a bug along with the hardware. So some lessons were learned in this some 20-25 years back in the Navy, when we launched our Kaio system for one of our leading frontline ships. And I'm sure these lessons have been factored in not only in the subsequent ships, but also across the Navy in many applications both ashore as well as afloat. And I'm sure this would have got exchanged with the different agencies in Delhi who are dealing with on policy network, of which, of course, you're a part as well. So thank you very much for giving us a very wide, view on this aspect. As regards 5G, I just want to add, while 5G offers a huge flexibility, a huge amount of efficiency, which you can sort of tap from the network, you rightly pointed out that it makes many of your services highly vulnerable for making sure that it is cyber risks are absolutely negated. I'm sure the audience will have many questions to ask, and they will put it through the chat box. We'll have your question answer session after the end of the session. In this session, there we got only 2 speakers, so I will go to the next speaker. And the next speaker we have is Dr. Shailesh Naik. Dr. Shailesh Naik is essentially a geologist who earned his PhD from Baroda in 1980. And thereafter, he was associated with many research programs as a part of Space Application Center in Ahmedabad. He has been looking at research related to marine and water resources. And for many years, he progressed this research work and went up in the organization. And after nearly 30 odd years, he became the director of Indian National Center for Ocean Information Services. And he continued in that line. And thereafter, after 7-8 years more, he became the Secretary of the Ministry of Earth Sciences. I would presume that you would be the first secretary with this designation of Ministry of Earth Sciences, which of course he can confirm to us, because it's a recently named ministry as Ministry of Earth Sciences. And he was there for a long period from 2008 onwards, during which he gave leadership to many research programs pertaining to monsoon, polar science, deep sea mining, vulnerability of systems while they're working out at sea, and so on and so forth. And he is one person who has huge amount of experience in this particular line. And with his experience and as well as the administrative role, I'm sure he is going to speak to us and share with us a lot about how does India and China play out together in the Arctic as well as in Antarctica. That's what he's going to speak on to us. And presently, Dr. Naik is also a fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences, Bangalore, and as well as of the National Academy of Sciences, India in Allahabad. So I would like to welcome Dr. Naik. We look forward to your presentation. We have about 20 odd minutes for you. So 3:35 would be the time you would like to finish. So around 3:30, 15 minutes after, I will just give you a gentle reminder. So may I now hand over to Dr. Shailesh Naik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for a very generous introduction. What I'm going to do is I'm restricting my presentation only to the Arctic because I thought both the time which is allocated may not be able to do justice. So I will just restrict myself to Arctic. And basically the Arctic last 2 decades or so has been in the news for a variety of reasons. And mostly it is because the sea ice is melting, and that has a lot of implications.
Dr. Naik, sorry to bother you. Can you be a little closer to the microphone? I think the volume is a little lower.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now it's okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
So, last couple of decades, the Arctic has been in news, and for a variety of reasons, scientific, economic, geopolitical, and many others. And I will share my presentation now, and will try to explain you uh, what India and China has been doing or we should do. Uh, the most important aspect of the Arctic is that the polar regions, as in the Earth science, we think that the whole globe or whole Earth is a single system. I will explain you slightly later. But the changes which are occurring, next, changing which are occurring in Arctic have not been fully understood yet by us. But we know very precisely that it is affects our weather, climate, and the ecosystem, not only in the Arctic, but as a global as a whole. Now, the first thing which we know that the sea ice, which has been reducing, and it is every year you will hear the news that it is the lowest coverage which we see in the September. And it has many implications, but you know that with the less sea ice, the amount of energy which is reflected back is reducing continuously. So it affects the energy balance, and it absorbs more and more energy. Oceans absorb more energy instead of reflecting back. So ocean becomes warmer, and that affects the ecosystems, the fish and all. This is the one major thing which is happening. The second thing, apart from sea ice, the land ice sheets or ice caps also reducing, and that actually affects the global sea level and also the ocean circulation. So both this together, if you take the reduction in the sea ice as well as in the land ice, it also puts large amount of fresh water into the ocean, and that makes many other changes, including our monsoon. And because of the monsoon is changed, it also affects the socio-economic systems of regional and global consequences. And these changes are not confined only to India also, but it affects entire globe, and specifically for monsoon, it affects the Asia, especially the India and China. The fourth thing which is happening in Arctic is much more serious, but not much attention has been paid. As the warming happens, the permafrost releases large amount of methane, and currently it is something like 17 million tons of methane which is going into the atmosphere, and that in turn again further warms the atmosphere, and the feedback is that you will get further warming. And the consequence of these methane, we know that the warming has a tremendous impact. We have been seeing one of the impact is the cyclone. 2 days back we had a cyclone. This was the third one, and the fourth one is already in making. So the changes which affects in Arctic is affecting to us and many other countries very much. And that is the one reason we need to pay attention to it. Next.
Dr. Shailesh Nayak, are you using a PPT?
Yes?
We can't see it.
Oh,
Okay, we have the presentation now. Dr. Nayak, you can perhaps just run through the slides which you already covered.
yeah. Next. So this is what I was saying, this we already discussed. The reduction in sea ice, land ice, their implication, as well as the release of the methane from the permafrost. So these are the changes which are broad changes which are happening in the Arctic. Next. Now this changes has a lot of implication. One, the access to the gas and oil reserves, which is almost 30 and 13% of gas and oil reserves of the world, is now accessible. And many companies, including ONGC, has started exploration in this. The second thing is the availability of a very critical metals and rare earth elements, uranium, niobium, platinum group of minerals. This especially in the Greenland. These are now accessible, and some China has actually started mining as well. The third is the opening of the shipping routes, both on the North American side and north of Russia. These are likely to open up. Some part is already opened. And this will become about 25 and 40% shorter than the present routes, let's say for the Alaska or for the, on this side, say, Korea. This will also lead to shipping industry, especially polar vessels. The ice class and icebreaker class vessels are likely to be required more and more. And this kind of development, which also will lead to certain hazards, especially if there would be oil spills, the methane release, there would be issues related to ecosystem. Now, the environmental cost of this development, as we know, that the weather will be, extreme weather will be much more in Asia, and the most of the cost of this degradation will be paid by the developing countries. And one estimate which is very staggering, that it would be something like $60 trillion if all the methane is released, goes to the atmosphere. So it's a huge cost. We may have the development, but we can have a large cost pay for the degradation of the environment. Next. Now this Arctic, as you know, it's managed by Arctic Council. This is one of the very good example where especially USA and Russia, last several years they have been adversaries, but all these Arctic nations are united as far as Arctic is concerned. And they, of course, addresses various issues, including scientific, environmental, cultural, as well as the certain developmental issues. The entire Arctic Ocean per se are covered by one or other 8 nations. And after the legal continental shelf, which will be put into place, there won't be any place for anybody else. And the interesting thing is, wherever there is some issues like Russia and Norway, they have settled those issues and they have gone together for CLCS. So the huge resources are there, and entire resources are covered by these 8 nations. Now in 2013, India and China got the observer status, which actually allows us to make contributions in the working groups. Various working groups are there on variety of the aspects. And but you don't have any say as far as the management of Arctic itself. However, as an observer, you would be knowing what is happening in the Arctic Council, and indirectly you would be able to influence the decisions of the Arctic Council. Next. Now, as far as India is concerned, last 2 decades, India's main interest to understand the Arctic, what is its role in the global system, and how it is going to affect us, especially Indian subcontinent. So why we are gone initially to Arctic, we have been working in Himalayas and Antarctica for last several decades, and we are trying to understand how the snow and ice interacts with the atmosphere, hydrology and the ecosystem, and in turn, how it affects our weather and climate and ecosystem. So we have large experience in working in this kind of thing, so it is natural for us to go to the Arctic. The first expedition was taken in 2008, and we commissioned a research station in what called Himadri in Svalbard in 2008. As far as Arctic is concerned, we were part of the Svalbard Treaty, which was 1920, actually as a part of British Overseas Dominion. So we can engage in the commercial activities, especially at that time, coal mining. And of course, we never did any mining there, but in principle, we can still do the mining. I mean, we have rights to do that. And the first scientific study, which was jointly done by Norwegian scientists in 1962, essentially to understand the various paleoclimate of this region. So India has a very good chance and scope, and it is an opportunity along with the global scientific community to build a knowledge what is happening in Arctic and its consequences. Next. Next. Now, why it is important, I won't go into the details, but all kinds of changes, especially if you can look at the changes which is happening in the cryosphere, snow, frozen ground, sea ice, ice sheets and glaciers. This actually affects when it interacts with the atmosphere, whether it interacts with the ocean, or interacts with the freshwater or the hydrosphere, or the biosphere. All this indirectly affects the entire Earth system. So even if it is quite far off from us, it does affect the globe as a whole, and that is one reason why we should do our presence in the Arctic. Next. Couple of examples. One, what happens, as I told you earlier, if there is a more fresh water released in the Arctic and North Atlantic, the global, this conveyor belt which we call, will get affected. And once this large circulation is affected, that would make a major change in the monsoon. Some of the scientists believe that it can bring to persistent drought if this is affected. There are also evidences that it can increase the monsoon as well. So there is a lot of work is being done to understand this phenomena as of now. Yes. At the same time, what happens especially in Himalayas and especially northwest Himalaya, whenever we have a huge intense monsoon convection, the latent heat which is released travels right up to the Arctic, and especially in the Canadian Arctic, and it leads to a melting in the Arctic. So there is both ways feedback. What happens in the Arctic also affects us, as well as what happens here is also going to affect the Arctic. Next. So in this reason, India has started observing the Arctic. We have station in Himadri, in Svalbard, in New Ellison, where many other countries have their stations. We have set up one mood observatory, which measures variety of parameters at the different, and this mood buoy is active even when the surface is covered by the ice. So we get round the year what's happening in the ocean. We have also put a atmospheric observatory, so we know what's happening both in the atmosphere as well as in the ocean, as well as we make measurements on the snow and ice. As you can see, in the last figure, we also measure on the glaciers what is all happening. So we have a very comprehensive measurements going on for last several years and variety of aspects at the Himalaya. Next. Now, as far as China is concerned, the most important aspect is China considers it's a near Arctic power. The white paper which they have published in 2018, which very clearly says it's one of the continental states closest to the Arctic Circle. So indirectly they are hinting that though we are not in Arctic nation, we are the closest. And that they want to make a difference to the rest of the countries, that they are almost as a Arctic nation. And this is what happened, I think. No, this, we lost the connection. Yeah.
No, you're okay. You're okay. You're okay.
This issue and that what they are very clearly states, the first thing they are saying increasing exploration and understanding of the Arctic. Though it means that mostly related to weather and climate, but the exploration means very loud and clear that they have interest in the resources. The second, they say protection of Arctic environment and addressing climate change, which is more or less saying what India has been saying about this. But the third is very important, utilizing Arctic natural resources and encouraging tourism. Participation in Arctic cooperation and governance, and of course, they're promoting peace and stability in the Arctic. Now, what they have been doing is, directly they are unable to influence the Arctic Council. So they have entered into various bilateral understanding with the most Arctic states. And where they use their economic power, they have invested very heavily in the petroleum in Canada, rare earth and uranium in Greenland, aquaculture in Iceland, and in Russia, again about the liquid natural gas, and many others. This is just an example. So they have been very clear strategy. And the other thing which they are doing is the cooperation with the various research institutes, which are non-state networks. That means various universities, research institute, they have made a very extremely good network. Next. Now, why they are doing? The first is, major thing is the domestic requirement and the development. The climate change is very much important for them because what is being felt now, that the changing pattern of the rainfall can bring lot of floods and droughts alternatively, and that can affect the agriculture in the long term and thus the food security. And also the long persistent drought can lead to desertification. So one thing is they want to understand this, and that is also one of the reasons India also is trying to understand what exactly is happening as far as the climate change is concerned. But the second is very important, the economic aspects of Arctic passages. They have very keen interest in developing this shipping, especially the northeastern sea route, and develop the infrastructure necessary, the ports, etc. And this they will be linking to the Polar Silk Route, what they have been saying. And the third is, of course, the petroleum, because they are 23% of energy consumption is by the China today. And they want to make sure the energy security for their country. Also the Arctic tourism. Today, out of 3 tourists to Arctic, 1 is Chinese. The huge Chinese presence today you can see in the Arctic. And I think the main interest is strategic, is essentially to access to hydrocarbon, rare earths, and the shipping route. That is their main goal for the Arctic. And the one reason, in Iceland, such a small country, the Chinese embassy have more than 300 personnel. So it's a pointer that they are using small nations like Iceland, Greenland, to promote their interest in the Arctic. Next. Now, what is the advantage of the shipping route? One, of course, the Arctic energy resources and rare earths. So that is the first. The second is the Middle East is becoming little unstable. and this will provide them a very safe route from Arctic to China. The third is the military advantage. We have been recently I have been hearing some of the talks that if India-China war can happen, India can block Indian Ocean and their energy resources which goes from Middle East to the. So they want another route. In case of this would be provide another route. So this also they are linking, as I told you, with the Polar Silk Route, basically transportation infrastructure they are building, and also the Finland has Arctic corridor, and I understand that they have been in discussion with Finland to complement this part. The shipping traffic is likely to increase than about 5% of the total traffic of China by 2050. So of course this is a very long time, but I think they are planning well in advance for the what is likely to happen in the near future. Next. Next. Now, as far as India and China are concerned, there are a lot of similarities. As I told you about the cryospheric research, both India, China are active.
Dr. Nayak, just another 5 minutes, please.
The Antarctica both are active. They are also the Arctic region influence on this. They have already 2 polar icebreakers, and India is yet to acquire a polar vessel. And the many international fora we have been participating. Next. Next. Like in China has a Chinese Arctic and Antarctic Administration, we have Ministry of Earth Sciences, we have Polaris Institute of China, we have the National Center for Polar and Ocean Research in Goa. But of course they have also one center in the Nordic Arctic Center in Shanghai. Of course we have a good understanding with the Norway, and we have been also working, but we don't have yet a center. And they have already formed Arctic Circle China Forum. We are yet to do that kind of. Next. So why India should have a strategy, which we don't have as of now? One, as I told you, that the Indian monsoon and vice versa. This is the most important reason for we should have a strategy. Second is we need to have stations in Greenland, Canada, Alaska. We already recently set up a station in Canada, and we should have Greenland and Alaska as well. Another important thing which we need to do is a satellite receiving station in Greenland. In India, we have all kinds of satellites, but we don't receive the global data in real time. We have one station set up in Antarctica, but that covers about 10 to 11 orbits. We need to cover all 14 orbits. So we need one more station in the north, in Arctic, and possibly in Greenland, so that we can get the entire world data in a real time. Also, it will provide an access, what is our strategy for oil and gas, critical metals, shipping routes, seabed surveys. All this we need to identify that what should be our strategy as far as this is concerned. Next. So what I would say that India should focus essentially on the developing appropriate environmental policy for that. That's a very important thing. It is for the global good, and Arctic also has the environmental protection strategy, which will allow us to influence the environmental policy of the Arctic. Second is how Arctic should be governed as far as the energy and mineral resources and these things are concerned. Vis-a-vis the environmental policy, because if the development takes place, it is going to affect India as well. So we need to have our strategy that what we are going to do if the energy and mineral resources and the development takes place in the Arctic. Of course, we have Arctic nations are looking for the joint initiatives. As far as I know, Norway and Denmark are very, very keen. Canada is very keen. Somehow with Denmark, we have not been engaging, but I hope there is a meeting with you when both Prime Minister met. We need to engage Denmark. With Norway, we are extremely good. So we need to have two kinds of strategy. One is the large states like Canada, Russia, and USA, and the smaller states, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, or Sweden and Finland. I'm not very sure Sweden and Finland, but I know Norway, Denmark, and Iceland are very keen to practice. In the Asia also, we need to interact with the South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. They are also have the observer status as far as. And we need to participate very effectively in all international fora, Arctic Council, International Arctic Science Committee, Arctic Circle, Asia Forum. There are many others, and which way we would be influence the governance of the Arctic Council. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Dr. Nayak, thank you very much I just feel like a student who had just attended geography class, who heard so much about Arctic. Unfortunate part is I've been sitting in the back bench where the audio has been poor. So I have been trying to glean as much as possible from what could come over the net. But I think you gave a very, very comprehensive coverage on what Arctic is all about, and very chilling factors that come out from your presentation about the extensive gas and oil reserves, the availability of critical metals, and how there could be changes in the climate in different places on what would happen in Arctic in another 20 years, including what could happen to our monsoon. So far, we have been worried about only El Nino, but I think there is something else which is going to happen after 20-25 years on what will impact on our monsoon. And I'm sure there will be someone who will be asking a question on this about how this would impact. The opening of shipping route via the Arctic, I think was very briefly touched upon in one of the earlier presentations in the seminar, and how China would be considering it. But some inputs have come from you saying how icebreakers and ships which are constructed to ice class would be able to operate in those waters, and they'll be able to benefit from lesser time in navigation, even though it may not be possible throughout the year through that. Frankly, I did not know about that there is already a station set up by India in Himadri way back in 2008, and there have been many interactions between India and the nations of the Arctic Council. There's 8 nations which are there in Arctic Council. We have been an observer status along with China. But China has taken a step forward, and they already got a lot of bilateral engagement with those Arctic nations, be it for research and development, or be it for some sort of service support for their explorations. But I think they have a plan very clearly, and much of it was also mentioned by you about the various participation in them in international fora. Also having a very well-staffed Chinese embassy in Iceland. So all in all, this is going to be a new frontier for us, as well as for us to meet the China in Arctic. And I'm sure this is going to open up a whole lot of debate in 10 years' time in our country about how we should look at it. But I'm happy the Ministry of Earth Science is already looking at Arctic as an area where we need to have also bilateral engagements with the other nations of the Arctic Council. I'm sure the next stop is going to be only deep sea mining. I can see it, because after Arctic, where there's going to be conflict in interest is going to be in deep sea mining. And I'm sure there could be someone who would be asking you a question on this, on how do you see that sort of conflict coming to the surface. Till now, it has been more of scientific work in the deep seas. So I would like to thank you for giving a very, very informative, comprehensive talk on what is happening in the Arctic. We come to the end of this session. In this session, we had only two presentations. One earlier by Professor Kamakoti and now by you. I would like to thank both the speakers for their wonderful presentations, very incisive information they could share with us. I'm sure there are some question answers which would be taken up now. So hand over to control to Aishwarya. If you could just navigate through the questions and post to both the speakers.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Sir, some of the questions posed to Professor Kamakoti have already been answered in the chat box itself. Shall I read them out?
No, you start with the questions on Dr. Nayak. But meanwhile, let me just go through the answers because I have been trying to get some audio out of my laptop. I've literally got my ears to the laptop, actually. I've not been reading the chat box. If you could just
All right,
go through Dr. Nayak's questions, please.
All right, sir. Okay, sir. There's one question for Dr. Nayak, and it's from Bipindeep Sharma. The question reads, looking at the emerging geopolitics of the Arctic, don't you think that it is a high time for India to have a full-fledged Arctic policy / strategy document, not only from scientific perspective, but also from geopolitical perspective? Your comments, please. Thank you.
I fully agree. Actually, I've been advocating for the last 4 years with the government's different bodies, including MEA and NSA and all those, that we need to have a clear strategy and policy as far as what we want to do in Arctic. And I understand that they have been addressing this issue, and I'm sure that we will come up with the appropriate policy very soon.
You have any more questions, Aishwarya, on the chat box? I don't see them anyway.
No, sir. No, sir. No other questions for Dr. Nayak.
Okay, but I have a question for Dr. Nayak.
Okay.
Dr. Nayak, there are a lot of technological challenges for us to even progress some of the research and development or any explorations which can take place in Arctic. Huge lessons have been learned from Antarctica. So therefore, we could be better equipped with knowledge, better equipped with systems which could enable us to launch some of these studies and explorations at a slightly higher level of preparedness. Can you just comment on that? And I have one more question after that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have been working in Antarctica for more than 3 decades. And around the year, our presence is around the year, right up to when the minus 70, 80 degree temperature as well, we have been surviving there. So we have the necessary knowledge and know-how, how to do the exploration or how to do. The only issue is the two things. One, this is pretty expensive. The exploration in Arctic kind of environment is pretty expensive. And the second thing is the necessary human power or manpower which you need. Unfortunately, we do not have any university in India which, at least at the postgraduate or a doctoral level, deals with the cryosphere or Antarctica or Arctic, So we don't have sufficient people. So we need a large amount of people to be trained to be work in the Arctic. Because the research, you don't need so many people. But when you really want to explore and all, then you need a large number of people to be trained in this. So at the same time, when we say the policy also needs to look at how to build capacity to explore and in Arctic. So there are several issues technologically, human related, and all that has to be built as far as possible indigenously. Then only we would be able to successful in Arctic. Otherwise, we would be dependent on someone all the time. Then we won't get that kind of respect which we can get if we are on our own. That is what most important.
Thanks, Dr. Naik, on that. And I just want to ask you, the Antarctica station was named Gangotri, if I remember right. And you were in Ministry of Earth Sciences in the leadership role when you have selected the name Himadri for Arctic. Any specific reason why you selected Himadri?
Not very specific. Our first station in Antarctica was named Dakshin Gangotri, which is already now below ice. We have two stations in Antarctica, one Maitri and another Bharti. So this, we thought the Himadri would be better option we have. And there is nothing specific. It is just to say Him and Adri, that the two
Okay.
entities, that's the only thing.
Okay.
There is no specific reason, yeah.
Okay, last question from my side. There aren't any other questions from the audience or from the participants. I just want to ask you this, if you put on a scale of 10, the technological challenges of Arctic versus deep sea mining, where will you put these two? Well, you have been familiar with both the developments.
Yeah, I think the deep sea mining, the major issue is that if you have to work at 3,000, 4,000 meters below, is the sheer pressure is tremendous. So the material and all those kind of things, electronics, everything has to work accordingly, and we have that skill. I mean, our instruments are going right up to the bottom of the sea. So that is one thing. But in the Arctic, the issues are slightly different. We have now experience like our observation systems have been functioning around the year. But for exploration, the most important thing which we need is an icebreaker vessel. And that technology, I think, we must build, because you can get if you really want your presence, you need minimum 2 vessels, one for Arctic, one for Antarctic, so that around the year you are their presence. And you need an icebreaker. And now the breaker has also a very interesting thing, like what China has latest acquired, it can move backward and forward both. And that is,
Okay.
So these are the kind of things which we need to build. So I think the platform related technology is the most critical. The remaining thing, I think we should be able to manage, but the platform which you need is the most critical there. Because without a platform, you just can't go there. So the remaining thing, it doesn't work. So I think first
Yeah.
you should have a platform. That's the most important.
I'm personally aware of the Polar Research Vessel program, which the Ministry of Earth Sciences have been contemplating and finalizing the specifications. But there is a question from Bipindeep Sharma, who wants to know where are we now on the construction of the Polar Reserve vessel? Are we going to build in India, or are you going to acquire from abroad? I think very sharp question is asked, even though I know the answer.
Yeah, I think we should be able to do it now in India. When the first time we were discussing this in 2010-11, and actually already the party was finalized in Italy. Unfortunately, there are some issues related to, as you know, financial advisors and all, it were scuttled. But if we can have some collaboration with them, we can build in India. Our shipyards, are able to build nuclear submarine. I don't think this cannot be done. Only thing that the specific steel and certain welding techniques and those kind of things which we may need. And I think we can cooperate with someone and we can build in India. I think that would be the most ideal in my view.
Okay, that's good news for shipbuilders, that there will be some Atmanirbhar influence on Polar Research Vessel which will get. I hope it answers. So I thank all of you for your for the participants for the questions which you have asked, and now all it's for me to say is thank both the speakers for the comprehensive presentations they gave. So I return you to the control